with particular focus on politeness, impoliteness. And I found out last night when I was looking at his website that he even has an impoliteness website where you can learn about, and I quote, using and understanding offensive language. So if anybody has that desire, please go to Jonathan's website. There's a lot to be learned. I got stuck there for about half an hour. It was very, very entertaining. But back to more serious business. His research interests also include the history of English, cognitive linguistics, second language pragmatics, and something that was news to me, stylistics and Shakespeare. He has published a very, very large number of books and an even larger number of articles and book chapters. I started counting, but I lost track. He has a very, very, very impressive research record. So it's a great honor and pleasure to have you here, Jonathan. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Culpeper.
I'd like to start by thanking the IPrA and the local committee for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I really do feel the weight of expectation after a week of marvelous papers, and here am I hoping you're not going to be too disappointed by what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to be talking about politeness and impoliteness, and that reminds me to give you a little warning. There will be the odd example that may offend delicate sensibilities. I will deal with it in a sort of clinical fashion and just go charge through. But you've been warned. If you need to leave now, just go. I'm going to focus on reciprocity. This is what I've been interested in for the last couple of years. And I've been thinking about it and gradually getting my ideas together. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. The study I'll be talking about in the final part of this presentation, I've done together with Vittorio Tantucci, who's a colleague at Lancaster University. I'm going to open what I'm talking about with two examples. You do not need to, I'm not going to analyze them in detail. It's just to float the idea of what reciprocity is. The first example is a comedy sketch done by Monty Python. There's a comedy team that became quite famous in the UK. I don't know about around the world. This takes place in a butcher's shop. And you can see there's a sign at the back of the butcher's with cuts of meat on it. And it's an interaction between a customer and the butcher. It's a humorous thing. The thing about humor is often it's violating some pragmatic feature that is, we take it so much for granted that we're not really aware of it, and it pulls it right out. So I'll play this to you.
Good morning, I'd care to purchase chicken, please.
Don't come here with that posh talk, you nasty stuck-up twit.
I beg your pardon?
A chicken, sir, certainly. Here we are.
Thank you. And how much does that work out to per pound, my good fellow?
Per pound, you slimy trollop. What kind of a ponce are you?
I'm sorry?
4 and 6 a pound, sir, nice and ready for roasting.
I see, and I'd care to purchase some stuffing in addition, please.
Use your own, you great poovy pone-agger. Oh, certainly, sir, some stuffing.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, thank you, says the great queen, like a la-di-da pufter.
I beg your pardon?
That's all right, sir. Call again.
Excuse me?
What is it now, you great pillock?
Well, I can't help noticing that you insult me and then you're polite to me alternately.
I'm terribly sorry to hear that, sir.
It's all right, doesn't really matter.
Tough titty if it did, you nasty spotted prancer.
What you're not getting is the expected reciprocity. That's basically it. But let me give you my second example, which is where you do get reciprocity. This is from Twitter, and these are exchanges that come about in reaction to a young woman, happens to be one of my daughters, who posts a picture of herself with very curly hair on Twitter, and the following exchanges come along. I'll read them out. Yo, beauty, I'm jealous. I'm jealous of yours. That's the response. Okay, so my daughter's in the second one responding back. Next one. Cutie, thanks, love. Look at you, my lovey. I adore you, pretty. You're so beautiful. Thank you so much. Can you see they're very reciprocal? Each time the response is very carefully measured in relation to the first part. I'm not going to read you all of these because they continue. There's another 60 more. I now know why my daughter doesn't get much homework done, but never mind. Anyway, moving on. So let's stand back for a second and think about reciprocity generally. And I'm not going to start by thinking about language. I'm thinking about reciprocity in religion and in the law, which is where you can find it most obviously, I think. It's the so-called golden rule. In many religions, in the Christian Bible, you get this quote, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." But it's not just religion. Various legal frameworks have it embodied within them or as part of it. The lex talionis, the law of retaliation, is the idea that the punishment must equal the crime. It's the old idea of an eye for an eye. In fact, you find evidence of that particular law in the Code of Hammurabi, which is one of the oldest surviving, probably the oldest surviving legal frameworks from 1754 BC. And I'll give you a bit of it. It's actually, the law is written on the stone here. That's how it survives and passes through history. And law 196 is as follows. If a man destroy the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. If one break a man's bone, they shall break his bone. So you can see that eye for an eye thing going on. Actually, if you read a bit further into this, the application of this law is not for all people. It's cut by social hierarchy. And I did note that if you're higher up the hierarchy, there is not quite the eye for the eye. If you haven't offended or done something wrong and you were a powerful individual, it wouldn't necessarily be an equal thing going on. That whole idea of power affecting the application of the law will actually come out later in some of my examples, so hang on to that idea. The important point in all this, and I will do these important point bits just by way of summary as I go along. If you are nasty to me, I will feel morally licensed to be nasty to you. Let's think about what people have said about the idea of reciprocity in anthropology and sociology. Malinowski points out that rights and obligations are part of social machinery and realized in the equivalent arrangement of reciprocal services. Goldner, in a very important early statement on reciprocity, writes that behind reciprocity is a generalized moral norm which defines certain actions and obligations as repayments for benefits received. The important point. If you are nice to me, I will feel morally obliged to be nice to you. If we turn to politeness theory and go to a classic, Brown and Levinson, do we find it in the idea of mutual interest? Let me refresh memories on that. In general, people cooperate and assume each other's cooperation in maintaining face, such cooperation being based on the mutual vulnerability of face. So, is it the case that people reciprocate out of self-interest? Question mark. If that's the case, then the important point would be, I will be nice to polite to you because I want you to be nice, polite back to me. I think it's partly the case that this could be one factor, but it's not the whole story. There's definitely a however going on here. And that's because the moral obligation can actually trump self-interest. Sometimes people act not in their own interest, but because they feel morally obliged to do that. And there have been a number of studies that have shown that. Fair et al. 2002, for example, showed in their study that people are willing to undertake actions even if they are to their own detriment in order to maintain reciprocity. So the important point then would be people are often nice, polite to others, not just because they want them to be nice, polite in return, but because they feel they should. What about more recent politeness frameworks? It is definitely, the notion of reciprocity is definitely present in Spencer Oty's rapport management framework. It appears as a sociality right, particularly under the heading of equity, and she defines it the belief that costs and benefits should be fair and kept roughly in balance. And that's really all about reciprocity. So the important point, people are often nice, polite to others because they feel they should match, return the niceness, the politeness that has been shown to them. And I'll certainly be picking up on this idea of keeping a balance and of matching and mismatching. That'll be coming up. Before I give you my own definition of reciprocity in the context of politeness and impoliteness, I'm just going to pull in two useful ideas from politeness studies. The first one is a simple one, but I think it's useful. The idea that politeness is some kind of social payment, or in other words, politeness is like money. The second one I want to use, and in fact I'll come back to this at the very end of the presentation, is the distinction that some researchers have made, Culpeper, for example, Watts, between politic behavior and politeness. You will note that politeness has a little n by it. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me define those two things first. Politic behavior, the amount of politeness that is expected in context. Politeness, more politeness than is expected in context. Some people have described this as the surplus approach to politeness. We are doing more than is expected. The reason I put a little n there, because I'm actually using the word politeness in two different ways in this presentation. So far, I've been talking about politeness generally, but when Watts is using it, here it means in contrast with politic behavior. So the broad idea is that politic behavior, politeness, the whole lot, this is all within politeness. But when Watts is using, he's using it in a narrow sense as meaning in contrast with politic behavior. That's why I've put an n by it, n for narrow. That's the narrow sense, not the broad thing. Let's try and clarify this a bit more with some examples. Politic behavior, here we come. I've taken actually an example from Watts, and I've kind of reworked it to illustrate what's going on. Hello, followed by hello. Hello, perhaps a politic behavior, a very regular expression, followed by a regular return, reciprocal behavior. Non-reciprocal behavior, hello, and then silence. It's not reciprocal, and it's not polite. We can rework it in other ways. Hello, it's so great to see you. Now that's polite. That's doing more than what is absolutely necessary. It's a surplus, if you like, of politeness. So this is polite N in Watts' terms. It's going beyond politic behavior. And the B replies, hello, it's so great to see you too. They're reciprocating with the same kind of thing. You could have non-reciprocal behavior there. Hello, it's so great to see you. That's polite in the narrow sense. Hello. Obviously, it would probably depend exactly on your prosody with the hello, but let's assume it's not an incredibly enthusiastic hello. Then that's not enough to match the hello, it's so great to see you bit that's come along. So this is not reciprocal and it's not polite. Okay, so reciprocity and politeness, impoliteness. So far I've been talking about, we're concentrating on politeness. What about impoliteness? I have a feeling that reciprocity also applies to this domain as well. Have a look at this example. This is actually an example, I love this example, it's from Leslie Beebe, who, and it's recorded, it's field notes, and it's an altercation at a traffic lights. Oh, shut up, you fat pig, go fuck yourself. Go on a diet, go fuck yourself. So we have impolite, 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 and they're reciprocal. So they're going along in this kind of way. So I kind of get the impression that reciprocity, at least in some impoliteness context, is working roughly the same way. Let's move on. So a definition, I promised it to you, here it is. Impoliteness reciprocity is a constraint on human interaction such that there is pressure on an addressee to match the impoliteness threshold created by the aggressor, thereby maintaining a balance of social payments. What happens if there's mismatching? And that's the really interesting area where you have non-reciprocal exchanges. Have a look at this example. This is a tweet from Chelsea Clinton. You might not be able to see it very well, and I want to show you her. She was reacting to something said to her. So I've transcribed this on my next slides. Starts off, Shay says, or tweets, I should say, I donated to the let's help Chelsea Clinton not look so much like a horse fund. Now, actually, that is pragmatically very interesting how she does that. I'm not going to talk about it, but we all agree that's implied. What does Chelsea Clinton say back? Hi, Shay. Hope you're having a lovely Saturday. Now, this is clearly not reciprocal, and it appears to be polite. Yeah, I mean, on the surface, it looks polite. It's a tricky one. What she seems to have done here is an upshift. So the starting point is implied, she's shifted up, she seized the moral high ground. And actually, it's not just that tweet. This is something that Chelsea Clinton does regularly. I've collected a whole load of examples where she does exactly the same thing. And there are lots of people who, after she does this, they tweet in and say, you're such a wonderful person, and all the rest of it. Of course, I wouldn't deny this. Is it actually sarcastic? Difficult to say. But anyway, I'll leave that thought with you. Here's another example of mismatching. It's a cartoon, and the person on the left is offering tea. Would you like some tea? No. Now, the joke here is that in British culture, if you refuse a cup of tea, that's as near as you get to anarchy, because obviously everyone would accept a cup of tea. But from my point of view, the interesting thing is the linguistics going on. You have a polite offer, would you like some tea? And this gets a flat no. So there's a lack of reciprocity between the first part and the second. That's the main point behind that. But let's generalize. If you have matching going on, this is the stuff of everyday routine politeness exchanges. For impoliteness, probably those tit-for-tat patterns going on. With mismatches, sometimes you have a strong downshift, and it's a means of rejecting something or somebody. I'm not saying these are the only things. I mean, these are the main ones that seem to come up. A strong upshift, a means of seizing the moral high ground, just as Chelsea Clinton did. The interesting thing about mismatching is it involves, I think, an implicature of some kind. Non-reciprocity and mismatch triggers impoliteness implicatures. How should we explain how they work? I think there are probably various ways of doing it, but I will try this one. I think you can do it via Levinson's M principle. Well, with non-reciprocity, what we have is an abnormal situation. And moreover, it's one that involves linguistic markedness. Noted in the examples I've shown you, you tend to end up with more prolix, more periphrastic forms, more infrequent or non-neutral forms, or sometimes a total absence of what you might expect in that situation, just silence. So it sort of fits the markedness thing. This is Levinson talking about the M principle. Marked or prolix anaphoric expressions will tend to pick up the complement of the stereotypical extensions that would have been suggested by the use of the corresponding unmarked forms. In other words, the use of a marked, non-reciprocal linguistic expression implicates that the stereotypical interpretation associated with the use of an alternative unmarked reciprocal expression does not apply. So if it's hello, hello, it's unmarked. If it's hello, silence, that's marked. And it means you're not doing the politeness, the reciprocal politeness that would be expected. That's what it's kind of implicating. Now, I've been talking about reciprocity as a kind of principle. I would never claim that it applies in all contexts. And in some ways, that's one of the most interesting things, to think about the context where it doesn't quite apply. And that is what a lot of the rest of the presentation is about, thinking about circumstances in which it doesn't quite work as you might expect it to. And for what reason would be the next question. This idea of things not quite working and why, I think Usami in her book, Discourse Blindness in Japanese Conversation, was actually touching on the kind of thing I'm going to be dealing with here. She does not look at reciprocity per se, but she does talk about downshifts and upshifts in her Japanese data. And she says, all of these have one thing in common. All of these behaviors reflect the power relationships between the speaker and the addressee. And I think that power difference thing does pop up in my data too. Remember, it also was in that legal code, the code of Hammurabi. I mentioned it briefly. That seems to be relevant. Let's look at some examples. This is an example from Michaela Lunan, who did a PhD thesis looking at nurse-patient interactions in doctors' surgeries. And one of the things she discovered time and time again is the lack of reciprocity by the patients towards the nurses. This is a typical interaction. A younger male patient is being called into the room by the female nurse, and the nurse says, "Mr. Smith, please. Good morning. Hi, Mr. Smith. While I'm here, yeah, I could really do to see Dr. Jones. I've started bleeding again. Mr. Smith, please, good morning. Hi. No, nothing coming back on that. There's no hello, anything, and it just goes straight to the task in the hand. Michaela Lunan also interviewed the participants after these interactions, and neither of these participants thought this was implied in any way. This was totally acceptable in that context. So reciprocity doesn't seem to be working here, or it's suspended, if you like. Let's look at another example, an infamous example, I would say. This is Nicolas Sarkozy, the former French president, who had a little altercation in a crowd. I've transcribed it. The French is on the left, and the English translation, it was very difficult to translate because taboo words are difficult to translate, on the right. But let's listen to what happens. Okay, so you can see it better. I'm going to concentrate on the red bit, the English, in other words. Well, it's quite obviously implies, and it's reciprocity all the way along. And then all of a sudden, thank you. What is going on? So I think you wouldn't really expect a president to get engaged in impoliteness reciprocity. And I think he just he forgets his role. And he engages in that kind of reciprocity. And all of a sudden he remembers, hey, it's not the role I'm supposed to be playing, and switches into this, oh, thank you. I have tried to look at his eyes to see if he's looking at a different addressee. It's very difficult to tell whether he's speaking to the same person or not, actually. But you can see in certain roles, reciprocity is not what you're supposed to be doing. I've studied traffic wardens speaking to car owners, and the car owners are vile, lots of impoliteness. The traffic wardens are never impolite back, except occasionally they use sarcasm. Why? Because if you say something like, have a nice day, and you mean it sarcastically, it can't be proven that you've just been impolite to the other person. So anyway, that is another situation where your role doesn't allow you to reciprocate. What I'm going to do in the remainder of the presentation is talk about a particular study that I've been doing with Vittorio, and we're looking at reciprocity in the context of requestive exchanges. I'm actually going to talk about two studies, and in some ways, the first study is just a means to allow us to do the second study. The first study, I'll tell you in a nutshell, in case it gets a bit complex as we go along. In a nutshell, in the examples I've been giving you, I've been putting little codings about what's polite or not, and earlier on I was saying this is politic, this is polite, etc., etc. But of course, that's just me saying it. And the first study is to try to get a handle on how people would perceive these things. Would it just be acceptable, fine, it's politic, or is it doing a bit more? So we've done this study to try and get a handle on the perceptions. And also, when you say something back, how, in that context, how is it perceived? Is it the right kind of reciprocating thing, or are you doing more, or are you doing less? That's what we're trying to do, to tease out. So, study one, 60 informants, and what we're investigating two things. The first one, A, because there are two parts to the study. A, task A, effectively, the degree of politeness associated with the expression of the first part of a requestive exchange, and this has much more of a pragmalinguistic focus. And B, whether the degree of politeness perceived in a requested exchange response matches that expressed in the first part. And this is rather more of a socio-pragmatic focus. And I'm going to deal with each of these in turn. So looking at A first, task A. What we did is we took 12 test items. They are requestive stems, and we actually were inspired by the work, the list that Karen Eimer presents in her book Conversational Routines, which is a study of what is going on through the London Lung corpus. I'm not going to read out all the stems that we were testing, but this is the full set of 12. Could I, will you, why don't you, could you, etc., etc. Then for each one of those, we took 3 different utterances or examples from the British National Corpus. So 36 in total, in other words, because we've got 12 stems. And then we tested used these on our informants, and we had a 4-point scale. The reason for 4 points is because we wanted to push them into a decision about whether they were politic or polite. And so we counted, if it was 1 or 2, we pushed that into the politic category, and if it's 3 or 4 on the scale, we pushed that into the polite category. And the question we asked them was the extent to which the speaker makes an effort to be polite. We phrased it like that because we thought, well, they're not getting a context, they're just getting the utterance. So it's really about the effort the speaker makes in calling up that stuff. These are the results. What you see, let me explain it on the vertical axis. This is, there are 30 informants, and they're looking at 3 different examples each. There's out of 90 there. And as I said, if an informant went for 1 or 2, it was put down in the politic category, and 3 and 4 would go on to the polite category. The gray are the number of hits or votes, if you like, for politeness. So on the far left side would be the ones that are most typical of politeness, and on the right side, the more politic ones. And that's sort of in tune with your intuition. I would be grateful. Would you mind? Perhaps you would. That's on the left side. And the more politic stuff, can you, let me, could you, all this sort of stuff going on that side. Okay, so then we made a decision to split into 2 broad groups, what we've thought of as our polite stuff on the left of the blue line and our politic stuff on the right. Incidentally, before I leave this particular figure, note that it rather challenges the idea that there's politic behavior and then there's polite behavior, because you see a rather nice cline going along there. It's not the case that it's just politic and then it's just polite. And that's what Dig Watts actually argues for. It's not really the case. In terms of operationalizing our study, this was a kind of useful way for us to do it for our purposes here. So we are going to treat the stuff on the left as the polite stuff, and the stuff on the right as the politic stuff. What is just expected, if you like. Okay, so task B, and this is looking at the sort of responses. How do we do that? So we had 20 exchanges, and they're based on the first part, and 20 utterances, including politic things like, will you please do them this year, Agnes? And a polite one, perhaps you will be able to, blah, 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 that sort of thing. So we had 20 utterances from the task I've just been talking about. All sourced from the British National Corpus, so all naturally occurring, as it were. And then we had a second part, which is to do with the kind of responses. We took real exchanges, as I say, from the British National Corpus. The 20 responses, we coded them according to whether they were accepting or refusing the request, so you're just saying yes or no, whether there was an additional comment or no additional comment, yes, sure, versus yes, nothing. And then whether the comment was supportive or mitigating or actually exacerbated the refusal. Unfortunately, I can't do this versus no, no way. We had a 5-point scale this time, rating whether B's response is impolite or polite. Here are a couple, just to illustrate, this is a couple of test items that we gave them. I'll read the first one out. I would be grateful if you could confirm your acceptance of this proposal. Yes, I will let you know as soon as possible. So that was one of the examples, and you can see the other one there. I won't read it out. Now, this is, I'm not going to go through this. It'll be a great relief to you because it looks a bit complex and I thought I'd take too long to do it. There's a rating scale on the left-hand side. The vertical one is a scale of politeness, and the various kinds of exchanges are in code at the top. But it's too difficult for you to follow. This is actually a statistical analysis based on Pearson residuals, and it's giving a sense of what is attracted to what, how much politeness is attracted to a particular kind of exchange. I have transcribed the results into something a little bit more palatable, and I'm going to talk about this one. So this is the way it works. If you have a politic first part, well, let's go through some of the rows. I'll look through this row first. You have a politic first part, for example, can you? And it's followed by acceptance and a comment such as, okay, sure. Then what the informants were rating that as was polite. And if you compare the two things in red, we've gone from politic first part through to polite. We've gone up. So this is a mismatch going upwards. Let's have a look at another one. If you have a politic start and you just have acceptance, you just say, okay, this is considered politic in terms of the scale. We gave them the 5-point scale, and it's a dead match. There's no difference. So can you, blah, 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 okay, fine. Now, I won't go through the rest, but these are the polite, we mixed it up with these ones as well. Again, I've sorted it out just for clarity. If you have a polite starting point, such as I would be grateful, or the other polite stems, and then that's followed by acceptance and a comment, okay, sure. We have a polite perception according to our ratings, and so we've got a match this time for that combination. I should put that there. Here's the next one. Polite first start and just acceptance. I would be grateful if you could, and you just say, okay. Actually, this one's slightly impolite, so you've got a strong downwards one going on. You can make it stronger. Obviously, if you say no, no way, you've got a very strong down going on here. Before I leave this, I'll just point out this one. This was actually the one from the cartoon. Would you like? It's similar to the would you like some more tea? And the response is no. And this is indeed a very strong downwards mismatch going from a polite utterance in the narrow sense through to refusal, flat refusal. You get impoliteness. You get this mismatch going down. Okay, so I could say a lot more about that. It's quite interesting how these matchings going on. We could talk about that, but actually, remember I said that this study was just a means of getting us into the next one, because taking the information we've got about what counts as polite or impolite, the kinds of exchanges and all the rest of it, what we wanted to do was to find out how that works in particular contexts. With a corpus-based study. So our question is, how does reciprocity interact with context? So what did we do? What we did is we computationally extracted those requestive stems from the British National Corpus. You have to manually verify them. If you have a particular stem like can you, some of them will be duds, real questions about ability, nothing to do with politeness at all. So you have to clean it up as you go along. So we extracted those up to 200 instances for each requestive form where they existed, and then we scaled the results. We coded each exchange that, according to the type of response, whether there's an acceptance, a refusal, comment, no comment, etc., etc. We also noted, we coded it according to whether there was reciprocity. And we did this on the basis of the findings from the first study, because we had a sense of what utterances would count as polite and what kinds of responses would count as polite or impolite and so on. So we could then do it. Then we plotted the results using multi-correspondence analysis. And this is a sort of holistic statistical take on the variables. What I'm going to show you is a plot on 2 dimensions, which really shows you what gets attracted to what and what gets pushed away. Those 2 dimensions capture about 81% of the variation in the data. Now, This is the plot, and I'm going to focus on particular bits and explain it as I go along. So the first thing I want to point out is this one. Now, you'll see a WD down at the bottom there. WD is weak down. So what kinds of contexts are you getting the weak down? You will see near the weak down, there's an S. And if you go to the code at the top, it's a school. In schools, you get weak down. You're not getting reciprocity, you're getting this downward stuff. Why? Because you have this power difference between the teachers and the pupils. You have the politeness coming up from the pupils, and the tutors, the teachers will just say, yes, go, whatever. They're not going to say, yes, sure, you can go to the bathroom, or anything like that. So you're getting this difference in that kind of context. Let's look at another example. PM, in purple there, politeness match. And you'll see it's very close to H. H is home. There seems to be reciprocity going on in homes. We're not saying anything about the level at which the reciprocity is taking place. Maybe it's impliedness of reciprocity, but it's reciprocal in that context. Interestingly, note that you have GP. GP, this is in doctors' surgeries, where patients go, local doctors, and the patients go for consultations. Interesting, you're getting a politeness match here. Now, you remember the nurse example I showed you earlier, where you were not getting it, but the nurse is much, much less powerful than the doctor. And it's quite interesting. I think there's a power dynamic going on in doctors' surgeries, where doctors are quite powerful, nurses much less, and at the bottom, you've got receptionists. But anyway, that's another story. Finally, just a quick look at this one. The SD down at the bottom right, SD for strong down. Where is this happening? You'll see BD quite near it, and BD is broadcast discussion. British interviews, political interviews, if anyone knows of someone called Jeremy Paxman, became famous for being extraordinarily rude to the interviewees that he had on the political program. And this seems to be reflected there, that there's not, if you like, niceness coming both ways, that there's a lack of reciprocity going on in this context. This is just a start, and we've actually redone the study using an even larger data set, and we're going to drill down into that a bit further later. So, brief concluding remarks. So, reciprocity, I think, is fundamental to the way politeness or impoliteness works in interaction, yet it seems to have been understudied. Yes, there are overlaps with preference organization in CA, and yes, there are overlaps with accommodation theory and sociolinguistics, but I think there are key differences too. Yes, in the study, we stripped away much of the context in order to control what was being tested. This is but a starting point for understanding the whole picture. Our corpus study shows that reciprocity is sensitive to context, I think especially power, in particular ways. Oops. Better hold out. Hang on. I've also shown, I'll speak fast, how we are developing a method to analyze reciprocity exchanges. And I've also pointed out the distinction between policy, behavior, and politeness it's useful for operationalizing stuff, but it's not really, it's really a continuum. It's not a further research. Well, what about departures from impoliteness? When I was talking about implicature, I was really thinking about politeness. Does it work exactly the same way with patterns of impoliteness? I'm not so sure. Our main study was not looking at that. We were looking at politeness. So that needs a bit more work. The other thing I should mention is that I've been talking about reciprocity in English and in Anglo cultures. So it may work differently in other languages and cultures. I think that's telling me to stop. I didn't have much left. That really was the last point. No, if we can get it to go. I will do my finishing, my ultimate slide if it comes, but I can start taking questions and I'll do, I know it sounds weird, but Okay, I will finish properly because I had an example just in case I had a little, but I was going to do this and say thank you. And also this.
We will definitely reciprocate. So thank you very much, Jonathan. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. No? Everything must have been crystal clear. No questions? No comments? Yeah, there's one there.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful speech. My question is that, have you ever considered reciprocity? So between different kind of relationships, you mentioned different contexts. For example, the acquaintance and unacquaintance people, between strangers or acquaintances. So they may have different kind of patterns of reciprocity. Yeah.
Okay. I heard part of that, but I'll talk about different kinds of contexts and reciprocity. So, well, I'll say two things. First of all, Vittoria and I have already begun to think about looking at reciprocity in Chinese cultures. And we were thinking about examining how people reciprocate when they are given new information. So the kind of oohs and ahs you might have to make or not, as the case might be, in the receipt of that new information. So we're going to look at that. The one thing I haven't spoken so much about in my talk is that my labels were generally, implied, implied, implied. But of course, you can achieve that in all sorts of different ways. So is it just the end result, the threshold that's been reciprocated? Or is there reciprocation going on in terms of, if you remember the Twitter example, some of the actual words were coming backwards and forwards as well. So the mechanism by which reciprocity is achieved is something that we could also look at in further work.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much again. In one of your last remarks, you mentioned there's a difference between reciprocity and preference organization. I work with this concept. So what is the difference between these two conceptualizations?
That's easy to answer because I would say ask the CA people. There needs to be a dialogue. I would be arrogant if I pretended that I'm a CA person and I think there are too many people who start spouting about CA and they don't actually do it. I know about it, but I'm not an expert. And so there needs to be a dialogue. Maybe if you are, we need a dialogue. But in my feeling is that a CA person would loathe the kind of study I've just done because that kind of experimental empirical stuff is not their kind of cup of tea. I'm a multi-methods person. I love using a bit of everything. And that's the way I would go into it. Also, Politeness is very much about judgments, contextual judgments, all the rest of it. And I suspect that's not so much a CA thing. The other thing is we use different conceptual terms and apparatus. When I hear a CA person talking about disaffiliation, I'm thinking, well, are they really talking about something else that I would, relate to something to do with face or something? Maybe we're using different terms, but talking about the same thing. There needs to be a dialogue.
Okay, good. Thank you very much again, Jonathan. Thank you.